Hello, I'm Noel Kingsbury, and with Annie Guilfoyle, I run Garden Masterclass. Now, this event is a recording of one of our Thursday garden chats, which happen at 6 o'clock London time every Thursday evening. This is a pro bono event, which we started doing in April 2020 during the first lockdown. Our aim is to talk to interesting and entertaining garden people. They could be gardeners, they could be amateur growers, they could be designers or botanists. And we talk to people from all over, from the Americas, from the Southern Hemisphere, from Asia. We like to think that we bring you the cutting edge of horticulture and our engagement with plants. So all of these recordings go on to our YouTube channel and eventually move on to our website. And the best ones are for members only. Our membership entitles you to access to premium material, to a forum, to keep in touch with other members and perhaps seek or offer information, and various discounts and special invitation-only events. Or, if you like, you can just keep in touch by signing up for our monthly email newsletter. So all of this is explained on our website, gardenmasterclass.org. So here's hoping you will enjoy this recording, and hoping perhaps you'll come and join us, or at least keep in touch. So now, Maurice, oh dear, the number of times we start off these broadcasts with me trying to work out how long ago it is I met somebody. Probably in the late 90s, wasn't it?
It was in the 90s. It's about 30 years. You probably came to Portland in 94, 95, I imagine.
Yeah.
So it would
95.
Be just shy of 30 years.
Yeah, yes. And of course, we haven't met up very often because I haven't often been to Portland, but you know, we've had some fantastic walks up the Columbia River Gorge and all sorts.
I added a picture at the very end, nostalgically, so that you could maybe remember that. That's Silver Star Mountain, a lovely trail. Yeah.
Of course, we've covered Portland already with Julie Weiss, who did a broadcast for us about a year ago about this extraordinary garden community in Portland, which is, I like to think, very much a product of an environment where there are so many different habitats and sort of ecological zones around, you know, what is actually a really interesting city. So now, one of the special things, of course, about the American West Coast is this connection with, you know, Japan on the other side of the Pacific. Now, as I understand it, Maurice, you're the third generation of your family to be a Japanese speaker.
Yes, I am. My grandfather was a missionary in Japan from 1911 to 1941. He was one of the very last Americans to be put on a vessel headed back to the United States. Then my father was a translator during the war, and he was born and raised in Japan, born down in Kumamoto, but he's spent most of his formative years in Asagaya, outside of Tokyo. And then during the war, he was a translator for the US Army, and he went back later on. We were assigned, he's a military officer, we were assigned to the Orient many times, Okinawa, Taiwan. And then ultimately he ended up in Japan after he retired and became the business manager of the American school in Japan, which was where he graduated in 1940. So, and I, of course, accompanied him when I was younger over to the Orient, and we visited Japan when I was 5 years old.
Wow.
And I have great memories of that. And then several times after that, when I lived in Okinawa, I went to high school there, and we took trips to Japan from Okinawa. And my graduation present was a trip to Tokyo.
Wow.
So that was such a great event.
Yes.
And after that, I went back and I wanted to explore Japan. This was back in the late 60s. I was in college, and I did a year abroad with Notre Dame University.
Right. Yeah.
My college allowed me to use their program, and then I went back immediately after I graduated, and I ultimately got my master's degree from a Japanese university. So, and it wasn't in plants.
So
It was.
tell us more about that master's degree.
Well, I've always been interested in the idea of performance, and I was caught up in a group of scholars that were studying Japanese folk performances. I was fascinated by the village rituals and performances, and so I began studying those. And later on, I got involved with the underground Angura movement in Japan, and I became friends with a well-known playwright named Karajuro, whose work I just love. I still love it today, but it's very urban, very, the life of downtown Tokyo, Shitamachi, and I just loved it. But I realized over that time period, the number one question I asked was not, who's that actor, but what's the name of that plant?
Oh, really? Yeah.
I must have memorized that. Every plant that I learned at that time, I was fascinated because the Japanese have a big cut flower industry, and they have, although they don't have gardens the way we have them in the United States and in England, they still do have flower shops everywhere. And if you go hiking, which I did, I was always interested in what I saw. And when I hitchhiked all over that country when I was young, and I stayed at a lot of farmhouses, and they were very welcoming. And I was fascinated by what they were growing and how they were using it. So that was my background that went into my mind. And then I thought I wanted to be a playwright, and I went back to the States. Oops. Right. I have no idea what that is. Something buzzed. If you hear gunfire in the background, I do live in the country, and we do have people doing target practice nearby. So
thank you for warning us.
And so after that, when I was in my late 40s, I began working with a friend named Mike Smith, and he was wanting to leave his career. I was wanting to leave my career, and we had been growing plants from seed from all over the world for quite a while, and we decided it was time to make a nursery. We didn't know how to do it, but we got together with a business a consultant, and she led us into the world of starting your own business. From there, we started our nursery. But right in the beginning, before we even started the nursery, I went back to Japan in search of clematis, because I knew that there were very few clematis from the Orient in the States. They were almost all hybrids. Whoops. Oh, you're going to show. Yeah. There's a story behind this, Noel. So I should tell you, the first step of my search led me to, maybe you could go back to Asao, but the first step of my search led me to a wonderful hybridizing couple outside of Nagoya by the name of the Sugimotos, Mikiko and Kozo, and they were so generous and so kind. They were tied into a very small clematis community in Japan, and what they gave me, they ladened me down with clematis, Japanese clematis, their hybrids and other people's hybrids, and I brought them back to the States, and we used them in developing some of the plant palette that we had at our nursery, Joy Creek Nursery. So about a year later, this was 1992, and in 1993 or 4, I got a call from Mikiko Sugimoto, and she said, "Maurice, Mr. Ozawa has had a vision." And I said, "Well, who's Mr. Ozawa?" And it turns out that Mr. Ozawa was the man that taught them how to raise, and this is Mr. Ozawa, you're seeing on the screen, how to raise clematis in Japan. Because even though large flowered parent, Clematis patens, is probably a native species. There's some question, but I think it's so widely native to all the islands of Japan, from Kyushu on up to Hokkaido, that it has to have a long history there. At any rate, Mr. Ozawa worked very hard to be able to do cuttings of clematis in Japan. He'd learned technical processes. He was a kind of a scientist, and he had always been a farmer. Very interesting story of going from being a farmer, recruited by the military during the war to raise food crops for the troops, and then ending up losing his battalion and living off the land for a year by himself in dense jungles down in Cebu.
Wow.
Before he was repatriated. Amazing story.
Mm-hmm.
And then he started a nursery for rhododendrons and enchanthus, beautiful, beautiful plants. But his love eventually turned toward clematis. And so that pink flowered clematis that I showed in the beginning, this first slide, that's one called Asao. It was a plant that he became well known for. And it's one of the very earliest of all the large flowered clematis to bloom for us in the West, in America and England. That's what it's known for. The picture I chose is a little pale. And the reason it's pale is I wanted to remember to tell this story. Mr. Ozawa discontinued growing that plant because the climate was changing. Even back in 1990s, he was very aware that it was so warm that the colors were faded on that plant. It used to be a very rich, when he first developed it back in the late 70s, it was a very rich rose color. And then it's faded to that form. So he discontinued it, but it was actually brought to England by Raymond Evison.
Oh, right.
I'm sure you're well aware of, and its twin, which Raymond renamed Pink Champagne, because he didn't like the Japanese name, which was Akio. Those are little villages around Mr. Ozawa's hometown. He named his plants originally after little villages. And so he discontinued that, but it's still alive and well in the West, where he always admired it when he came to visit, because we were still cool enough to have that good rose color.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, on the subject of Japan and clematis, and I was under the impression that during the Edo period, when there was just so much really innovative plant breeding, that this was where the sort of crucial genetic changes in clematis happened, with these axial buds that were very much, so it was very much, our modern clematis really date back to Japan anyway.
Well, they actually come from Clematis patens. The large flowered forms come from Clematis patens. And I think there are a lot of breakthroughs that do happen, but the big thing, Clematis florida also, what we know as Clematis sieboldii, also came by, but I'm not aware of a lot of crosses being done between those two at that time. What I am aware of is that Clematis patens was taken back to England and the rest of Europe, and it was then used as a hybrid parent. And of course, we know this history after that, the late 1800s, but it was crossed with Clematis viticella, some of those purples and reds and things. That was where we get the richer colors into the Clematis patens, because patens was always kind of pale pink, pale blue, white. So that when I was 5 years old, I saw a clematis on a lacquer box that was dark purple. And I thought that was a Japanese clematis all my life. And I never knew where I would find it. And then one day I was doing some not genetic research, but the history of hybridizing. And I realized that that had to have been the president, which was, that's what I saw, I'm sure. And it was, reproduced on this lacquer box, post-war period. I saw it. I just assumed it was Japanese. But
Yes.
they took those and then did more hybridize. It's a very interesting story of
Yes.
exchange of genetic material back and forth. So
Yeah.
anyway, speaking of exchange of genetic material, then the real interesting thing that Mr. Ozawa did was he finally said, I'm tired of crossing large flowered clematis with large flowered clematis because it is becoming a little bit like cousins getting together.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he said you get
Inbreeding.
some muddiness and you get
Yes.
some weakness in the strain. You always need to have the straight species when you're doing crosses. So he began to start a new industry. He's 60 years old and he starts a new industry, which is clematis for cut flowers.
Oh.
And some of the very first flowers that he begins growing are Clematis integrifolia, that herbaceous form with the long stems. They actually make wonderful cuts.
Wow.
And his first plants actually came by way of Sakata Seed, that's a big seed company in Japan. And I've traced it all back. Mr. Ozawa and I had many talks about this, and we actually went to talk to the person that gave him the original Sakata Seed plant. And he crossed them and developed parents for his later plant breeding.
Yeah.
So he had a huge, like a stable of various crosses that he was able to use for later material. And then he began to be interested in North American species, basically the Bjorne type and the Integrifolia type. And these were the crucial beginning phases because many of them had long stems. And I show you a winter picture in there of it's April, late April, of a plant called Hatsune no Kimi, which has about a 12-inch stem. And if you take it down below the first leaf axil, you can get 18 to 20 inches.
Gosh, wow, yes.
It's astonishing. And so he began developing those plants. His most famous, of course, is Clematis roguchi. And roguchi comes in two forms. The first plant, which he ended up giving to me as a favor, and we introduced it to the West. Roguchi, and roguchi is a cross between Integrifolia, a very good form that he had, and Clematis reticulata. And that's a little tiny bell-shaped flower, but it gave it this incredible ability to climb. And it was the first time Integrifolia got kind of wings that would take it up higher than so it goes about 9 feet. It's amazing. And quite a good in his growing areas. He would tie the stems up every day, go in so that he could then come in and harvest. He developed this wonderful house full of cutting plants that he would take to the flower market there in Tokyo. So I show you two forms, number one and number two. The second one is less prone to powdery mildew, and it has a little bit different blueness to the flower, but they're pretty much synonymous.
So presumably you were selling some of these clematis from Joy Creek, the nursery.
Yes.
So tell us about the nursery. I mean, you did a lot more. I mean, you did a terrific range of plants, didn't you?
We had a pretty big catalog by the time we stopped. But so I told you about my friend Mike Smith, and he had bought property in a little town outside of a town called Scappoose, which is about maybe 15 miles outside of the city of Portland. And we were able, there you go, a nice parcel of almost 40 acres of land. And I used to go out and visit, and we were raising plants at his old garden, and he took some of those over here, and I had gotten this interesting clematis. And we decided when we started doing our business plan, we needed somebody that was technically able to guide us through setting up a greenhouse and growing areas and the like.
Yeah.
So we contacted one of his good friends named Scott Christie, who had a degree from Cornell University. And the three of us got together, built greenhouses, dug a well, created this growing area. We were going to be a mail order nursery only, but that didn't last more than a year, because once people knew we were out there, they kept coming up the driveway. Nobody wanted to order. They wanted to buy plants. So we had to set up a retail area. And in the course of setting up the retail area, we decided to turn our gardens into our stock fields. So we created these beds. I think I have one or two photos of the nursery showing these are plants we developed over the years. But the borders, we had 2 acres of gardens by the time we were done. And because we had gardens there, the public wanted us to come and put gardens in at their homes. And so we developed a landscape business and a design business and a maintenance business on top of it all. And it was a lot of hours of work. And I no longer could go hiking, and I spent a lot of time doing public speaking, and I ultimately became the propagator for the nursery as well, the last decade. But we just, I was developing the retail yard. It took so much energy to get that running. And by the time we had gone into year 3 or 4, we were already doing classes at the nursery on a regular basis. And I had to arrange 30 classes a year, arrange for them. It was an astonishing feat to me. So getting local speakers that wanted to come out and talk about their activity, their hobby, was really wonderful. We had speakers, including yourself,
of course,
who came out for the Hardy Plant Society and gave a presentation there. So it was I did 30 years of that until my body told me that if I wanted to be able to walk in the future, I needed to stop. So I'm now retired, but it was I'm still going out to the nursery, of course, and helping out Mike occasionally. He still owns the property, but it's no longer a retail or a mail order nursery. It's a landscape division nursery.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, because it's a rich territory for nurseries, isn't it, Portland?
Well, you haven't been here for a while, Portland.
I haven't been for a while, actually. No.
It was quite an exciting town when we were younger. But what I found over the years is it's like all these towns that have become overdeveloped too quickly, and housing prices have they've gotten so amazing that most ordinary people can't afford to live here anymore. A lot of homelessness, and we've had a lot of the last 4 years have been hard on the city. The gardening community has been very active, but there's so many changes that have happened because of COVID, because of the political climate, and then now I think with all this modern technology, where we used to have regular meetings for Hardy Plant Society, so much of it is all done on Zoom. And we don't get together. I don't get to see my friends, and people stay in contact through Facebook and texts and emails and all that stuff. But it's odd. I almost see no gardeners.
It's a funny one. I know certainly in England, some of the, most of the societies have tried to go back to physical meetings, but I mean, some of them are doing. I'm just beginning to get lecture invites now to a Zoom-only meeting or a hybrid meetings that they have a big screen there that for people who don't feel safe coming in, or also, of course, means these local groups can actually pull people in from much further away. So I think we're at an interesting transition point.
Very interesting.
So now, also in Portland, I know you've been. I think one of the things you've been involved with is what you call hell strip planting. Which probably needs a bit of explaining to people this side of the pond.
I didn't create that phrase.
No, and
Lawrence Springer
yes.
used it in wonderful book, The
Spring.
Undaunted Gardener. Yeah, and she has given me permission to use that. she and I have talked about it before. It is a strip that can take abuse. And she was talking about those little parking strips that in American communities we have a strip that belongs to the city, but the owner of the house has to take care of the sidewalk.
So this is between the sidewalk, what we would call the pavement,
the pavement,
and the road, which is what you
and the
would
road. Yes, and I started doing them about 30 years ago at my home garden because I watered in the backyard. I had a home, and the front yard I didn't water, and so I started developing uses of gravel. We out here we're very keen on gravel. We have an endless supply of basalt, as you know. we live on 30 feet deep of a layer of basalt. But anyway, what we were finding that basalt was a great mulch for protecting the plant roots. And after I planted my health strip, I never watered anything in the front yard at all, and everything made it through year after year after year. I will not make any claims for the heat dome at 117 degrees, however much that is, up in the 40s centigrade, upper 40s, I think. It was pretty astonishing. So, but yes, and as a result of my interest in doing health strips at home and at the nursery, we did it because our well was very small, had a low capacity, and we didn't have enough water to water all of the plants in the nursery. So we made an entire bed that was done with this technique.
Right.
Beth Shadow, I got to spend some time with her, and we were pretty much using similar methods. It was very exciting and similar.
Yes, I mean, we're getting. We've had this from James Hitchmore, Peter Korn in Sweden. It seems to be increasingly a technique people are looking at. I mean, just the deep gravel mulch as a way of protecting plants and keeping weeds out. And
well, it doesn't keep weeds out. They blow in and. Actually,
I think if you go, I think they have really deep mulches of coarse material. They do, very coarse. Yeah,
I just find that if I use gravel when I'm doing a seed plat, I get really just a little layer. I get a lot of germination of seed, and I'm finding a lot of like wildflowers tend to seed a lot in place, and so I have big populations sometimes in that gravel the next year. Anyway, so I ultimately ended up doing a very large border garden for Reed College in Portland. I was about a 250-foot stretch at first, and that's held actually still remaining. This is almost 25 years later. It's not up, kept up with weeding and things like that, but it runs itself pretty well. And then they had me do an additional footage. So we had 450 feet total along this very busy road. It was quite fun. Great event. I've done lots of little health strips after that. I did a health strip for a power company that was starting to introduce solar energy. So surrounding their solar energy site, we put in a huge health strip there too. And that was quite challenging because they didn't have any water anywhere on the site. So we had to plan everything carefully to do that. Anyway, so those are health strips, and I know
one of the great things about walking around residential Portland is just the sheer density of the planting compared to many communities in the US. I mean, it's not just the health strips planted up, but people, really fantastic front gardens, and you feel a lot going on.
People pride themselves on in many communities, they do pride themselves on having beautiful gardens. And I think if you go over to the northeast part of town, near where Sean Hogan, who runs Sista's Nursery, used to live, he used to just pass plants along throughout the neighborhoods and say, you should put it there and put it there. And you would see these fantastic, unusual plants popping up all over the neighborhood. So it was quite exciting.
I remember that road he lived in. Yeah, that was fantastic.
I was going to, I don't know if you want to talk at all about some of the work that we did with hybridizing and selecting at Joy Creek.
Oh, well, yes, we should, yes.
Yeah.
So you worked quite a bit on penstemon, didn't you?
We did a lot on penstemon, but in the end, I counted it all up. We released 49 different varieties, which is a lot in 30 years, I think. Just trying to have one a year, something new and fresh. But it was, we did some purposeful crosses.
Yes.
And we just looked for things too. Our eyes were always looking for variegation, for different color flower, for foliage that was cut and or variegated. So we the first thing that we actually released was a grass called Gold Bar, Miscanthus Gold Bar, and I know that's in Europe now because we get royalties. We get royalties from that still, and that was an amazing experience. Kind of trying to market that to someone that would work with us. And because most of those kinds of crosses, I think, are being done by big businesses now, not so much the little independent grower. A couple of other things that I've been really interested in, we had a huge collection of the classic hydrangeas and a lot of hydrangea serrata forms, as well as paniculatas and things like that. But we began to find a strain of seedlings in our garden. Once I lifted about 1,000 different seedlings, and I grew them out in big flats, and then I made selections. I got it down to about 14 that seemed to have something interesting in the foliage. And then we released one of them, which was later called Eve. And it's very interesting because Michael Durr, who is the king of hydrangea hybridizing, wrote to me. He ordered it and wrote to me and said that it was it wasn't as interesting as I claimed it was. And that was year 2, and then a year or so later, he had the same gripe, and then he came to the nursery and walked around, and we were having a great time. It was really exciting to be with him and show him our plants. And he looked at Eve and he said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, she's wonderful. That blue, that foliage, it's so unique, and it's just a beautiful plant." And that was a great compliment to me that he finally. And I said, "Well, it does take a few years to grow out. It's not instant." And then there were a few other plants. I think I gave you a slide.
They're in the looping presentation. Yes.
Yeah, but of the penstemons, all the penstemons that we released, the goal there was to get, it was the Kissed series originally, or the Lip series, because we like the clean white throat with rich color around the border of the flower. And so we released 6 of those, and then also some other really interesting, more coral types, one called Aurora and one called Coral Flare. And then there's just so many different plants, but the only other patented plants we actually, in patenting, we had to have something that we knew would have universal appeal, so that it made sense to put it into mass production. Was another Miscanthus called Gold Breeze, which is quite big. The thing about both Gold Bar and Gold Breeze, in my book, they have the most distinct barring that I've ever seen. And it's evergreen barring too. If you look at the base in a milder climate, you'll see that barring continues from the moment it emerges all the way
Yeah.
up to the top, as you can see, and it's very dense. And Gold Bar grows taller every year. It can start out quite low, and then the next year get to 3 feet, and the next year get to 3 feet 2 inches, and ultimately year 8 it might be up to 4 feet or so. But it never gets taller than that, and it doesn't get so immense that it's hard to move.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I really admire that about it. You just flashed the agapanthus in front of me. We did some early seeding of agapanthus that had born hybrids, and we made a selection called what's that called? Joyful Blue. And we had another section of the garden where we had a different agapanthus arise, and so we called that Joyful Blue 2. And not very original names. And then we raised a helenium that has also been patented called Tijuana Brass. And the reason I really admire Tijuana Brass is because it has very thick stems, and it holds up to wind and overhead watering. So, if you need something that will stand up and not collapse like many of the heleniums.
Yes.
And there were a couple, we have 3 or 4 clematis out there. 2 of them that I attached slides actually come out of the genetics that Mr. Ozawa gave to me. One called Elegant Rhythm, which actually has 2.5 foot long sepals. I mean, not feet, inches long. The sepals are quite long and twisted, and pink pinwheel, which is really a winner in my book. It's extraordinary. It does open out like a pinwheel. When the seeds emerge, they're covered with the sheath leaves around it, but the reverses of those leaves are purple. And then the bud emerges pink out of it, and it's quite long. It can be 2.5 inches long too. One thing I didn't mention about Mr. Ozawa's crosses and what he was really interested in going for in these cut flowers was the length of stem. I showed you that, but also as for cut flowers, it was only for one industry, and that was cut flowers for the tea ceremony. That's one flower that had to sit in there and become the center of focus during the tea ceremony. But there are hundreds, maybe thousands of tea ceremonies conducted every day. And and so it would be a possibly profitable business. But he wanted to always have something unique, and so he was actually being very sensitive. He said, "I'm very sensitive to the colors that Japanese prefer and the shapes they prefer." And so when you look at his crosses, you can see all these wonderful, wonderful styles. The integrifolias were one of the parents he used, but later on, when he began to cross with the Viornis from North America, he began to get sensational colors, and some of them are ruffled, some of them, and they're all bell-shaped. And many of them have a waxy quality toward the sepals. And all of them have this kind of crook shank flower. It's on a stem that has a crook shank, but they're all dark stems. They have these beautiful colorations. Some of them have almost a warty surface to the flower, so they're unique. And I think then his dream, and I didn't get to tell you what that dream was, that vision he had, was to find the true Clematis texensis that gave rise to Sir Trevor Lawrence. That's why I put Sir Trevor Lawrence there. Sir Trevor Lawrence is all red inside. And if you look at the picture of Mr. Ozawa standing there with his prize Clematis texensis, it's white inside, it's creamy. And that was the only kind of texensis they knew in Japan, but he knew you couldn't get Trevor Lawrence from that,
Mm.
no matter how you did the cross, because the parentage of that, it's probably a large flower cross with that all red
Yeah,
Clematis
yeah.
texensis.
Mm.
So he asked me if I could take him out to look for texensis in the wild in Texas.
Wow.
And we went. We had this wonderful expedition, and we went finally to the Tarpley River area, and we were able to see it growing in the wild. And then we went to a ranch out there, and they were lovely, hosted us, and allowed Mr. Ozawa to harvest
Yes.
and buy some of their plants that were red with the red interior.
Right.
So that's the Tarpley River form, and the little one that he had with the cream center is often called the Austin form because that's how they look in the Austin area. So that began a new adventure for crosses for him. When he died in 2003, he left 1,000 intentional crosses.
Gosh, amazing.
And his nephew and nephew's wife took those and raised them all out over until recently. They've been doing it, made selections and introduced quite a few. And I grow about 45 of them here in my home garden.
Right.
It's astonishing.
Yes.
But I knew his plants could be good garden plants.
Yeah, that's
But
important.
that wasn't why he was raising them. So it's been very, very fun. Quite an adventure. Take it back to where we started.
Yeah, real privilege to have known him. I mean, you've traveled a lot. I know in Japan. I mean, there must be. I know it's a country you love, and it does have this extraordinary garden history, which plant history, which I think is very, very underestimated and not really known about much in the West. All that extraordinary selection, the work that went on in the Edo period and has carried on since.
It's incredible. Yes.
Yeah.
The closest I've ever come to it, Noel, is one of my friends, a very young gardener who came and stayed with me for a while, and whose father was an extraordinary hybridizer. He hybridized rock garden plants. So everything was miniaturized.
Yeah.
I mean, roses that are 2 inches tall and things like that, just astonishing things. But this young man took me into the countryside to a country flower market. And all of these small growers from all over the western side of Japan came to this market. And I mean, I was in awe looking at, 20 different forms of nandinas and 14 form. I mean, cut leaves and only getting that tall, or it was just astonishing, the variety, and that's I think that's a real. It's a shame that we can't have access to some of those plants.
Yeah, it was enormous.
We don't do rock gardening on that level. We don't have
not anymore.
No, and we're reduced to smaller. All of our gardens in Japan. They are reduced to very small gardens and what they can grow in containers. Some of the great hybridizers in Japan now garden on their rooftops. They have like 100 square feet and everything. Hundreds and hundreds of plants are stuffed all over the place. It's just astonishing.
Yes.
So, that's a labor of love, a true labor of love to keep that distinct.
And how do you feel about the traditional Japanese garden? I mean, it's very, very different to the kind of things that you do, but I mean, how much do you feel you're able to appreciate them?
I think that I've always loved the formal Japanese garden, and I think it's aesthetic of proportion and simplicity, reducing it down to elements that the eye can take in clearly and cleanly, is really valuable to me. I use those principles all the time. I have 10 acres here, as you know. There's a lot of land here. How you work with it, I think you have to make some choices, and I like that some of the Japanese choices where you have a simple palette and and a few things that your eye can focus on.
Yes,
Plus, I
yes,
love,
said for
yeah,
that. Yes.
the shaping of trees and shrubs that allow a sense of transparency, also incredibly valuable to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We live near a very fine Japanese garden here in Portland, as you know, the
You do,
Japanese
you
garden.
do. Yes,
And
yes, yes.
I've been in contact with all those, well, many of the gardeners that work there over the years, and they actually, guided me, allowed me to see what they were doing, and so I do admire that aesthetic very much.
Yeah. Yes, yes.
There's so many little tales that one could tell about Japan, and the odd context that one makes. I'm part of a program called the Great Plant Picks Program, which comes out of the Miller Botanical Garden in Seattle, and we are very regionally oriented for the Pacific Northwest. But there was a intern at the Miller who was Japanese, and we befriended him, and Richie Steffen from the Miller, he's the director of the Miller Botanic Garden, wanted to go to Japan to see him after he left. And so we went to Japan and went over to Niigata, met with Naoaki, and then I met his father, and it turned out his father was one of those gardeners at the Japanese garden that I knew
how funny.
years ago.
Yes,
and we had the best time going to look at gardens in formal Japanese gardens in Niigata that were being restored. What's happened now is, there wasn't a lot of money for restoring the castle gardens, etc. But the wealthy, some of the wealthy are buying them and restoring them to the original, and they're astonishingly beautiful because they have a mountain backscape, I would call it, really lovely, and a lot of water in Niigata.
Yes.
But it was quite exciting. A lot of the old manors that they can't afford to pay taxes on are now being turned into big gardens, theme gardens.
Yeah.
And they're being actually maintained by a lot of volunteer labor. The old farmers who have lost farms and the ability to go out and play in the soil are now volunteering to come and work.
Interesting. Yeah.
Fascinating. I don't know how long that will last, because the next generation has a different idea about labor in the garden.
Yes.
So
it's interesting that volunteering model is taking off in a very, because it's one that works in some cultures and not others, the volunteering model. And yes. I mean, also another thing that's come up over the years is these getting back to all that incredible heritage of Edo period plants. Some of these old families, some of the old aristocratic families, have these incredible collections, which perhaps over time the younger members lose interest in. And it's particularly actually the Higo family in Kumamoto, having emails from a colleague of mine there saying that this collection, which I think is irises, because the Higo camellias are pretty well distributed. Also Higo irises, and I think a couple of other things. Kind of, this collection is just on the edge of dying out, and the family don't want to let them go. What happens to them then?
Well, I don't know what will happen to them because of the way plants are marketed now. With everything has to be patented because you get the extra dollar, which allows you to continue your work. Yes. And those are old plants, and there's no profit in taking them on because you don't get the extra money. I'm not sure how you do it. It probably is always going to have to be maintained privately and maintained out of love more than anything.
Yeah. I mean, this whole business of patenting is interesting. You've been talking about it. It's come up in something where I think the American market is much further on than the European one. I mean, I've had a bit of correspondence lately about this, about how people are worried that in fact these patented plants, which obviously, of course, can't be reproduced and sold any more, are actually taking over the industry, and perhaps actually in many cases, having more, open pollinated, more genetic diversity in garden plant populations in a way is much healthier and much more appropriate for say ecological planting. I mean, it will be an interesting issue, I think, to explore further at some point.
I think that we are in for some hard times in the nursery industry, because
yes,
when I go to even very well-known nurseries, I find very little diversity of plant material.
Yes.
And that means we've come to a dead end.
Yeah,
in order to make money, a lot of money,
yes,
we've come to a dead end. And we have to go back to the original plants, and we have to find species, that can give us new life to those. It's not that the patented plants aren't, well, they should be crossed so we can create new diversity.
Yes.
And I'm very worried about that. I've been concerned about that for years, because I think you have to find a way to pass that genetic material on to the future. Otherwise, the plant is never going to get stronger or be adaptable to the changes that we're going to have up ahead.
Yes.
When Michael Durr came to our nursery, he almost started crying. And the reason, I hope he doesn't mind my telling this, but the reason, he said, I haven't been to a nursery like this for a long time. There aren't very many patented plants here in your nursery. It's all species and older selections that, and there's so much variety. I mean, we had like 140 different hydrangea forms, and he was just astounded. And that made me feel good, but it also made me feel incredibly sad.
Yes.
And I don't know the solution to having a better balance in the nurseries that I'm going to now. And now that I'm not working, so many hours a day, all the time, I can go to nurseries, and it's been very exciting. I found some wonderful new hybrids, and I'm very interested, but I still am very concerned about the model that we've set up, and I think we have to really have some serious discussions about the future.
Well, perhaps we'll perhaps try and organize a round table, on that, and play it and record it, and be a session perhaps for later in the year. No, we do try to cover these topics.
I think you really need a geneticist, because I don't really have that, but I do remember very clearly Mr. Ozawa telling me, if you're going to make a good plant and a new plant, you can use a hybrid, but you always have to have a species with it. You're good for 2 generations after that, but stop.
Yes, interesting.
And I've always followed that.
Yes.
So it's pretty fun being able to collect things in the wild, which we used to do, and that's why I had that picture of Silver Star, because I used to collect up there. And wanted just a little reminder.
So go back to the wild.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Maurice. That was a really interesting talk across a really incredible career, where you've dealt with some wonderful beauty, and you've communicated so much to so many people. And hopefully we'll be able to visit you again. And I don't know when I'll be back out to the Pacific Northwest, and I still haven't sort of, it's difficult to think much beyond the borders of Europe at the moment, although we are actually thinking, Annie and I are thinking about a garden masterclass trip to Japan in maybe 2 years' time. We've built up some very good contacts in Hokkaido, and obviously, of course, being good Kyoto as well. So we may want to talk to you about that. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh no. Thank you for the lovely opportunity.
Great talking to you.
To share. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye.